Victoria Dunn was 28, standing in a place she never thought she would return to, a life that once pushed her out and pretended she no longer existed. 5 years away had erased her from her own family, but somehow, she had built something new, something real, something she believed no one could take from her again. On her wedding night, everything ended. The car spun out of control before she could even understand what was happening. Headlights flooded the windshield, a horn tore through the silence, and then impact. Metal crushed, glass shattered, and in a single second, the life she had just begun disappeared. Her husband died instantly. Victoria survived. Barely. For a week, everyone told the same story. It was a tragic accident. Wrong place, wrong time. Nothing more. But something never felt right. Then the driver finally spoke. And what he said in that room didn't just change the story, it exposed something far worse, something that made every person standing there go completely silent, including her. Before we go further, I want to know, what time is it where you are right now, and what city are you watching from? I read every comment, and it tells me just how far these stories travel. If you're here for real, intense stories like this, make sure you subscribe and leave a comment below. Now let me show you how it all began. Earlier that evening, everything looked perfect from the outside. The ceremony took place near the water, where soft lights reflected across the surface and the sound of quiet waves blended with distant music, creating the kind of atmosphere people only saw in carefully planned weddings. Victoria Dunn stood beside Ethan Price, her hands steady, her expression calm, as if nothing in her past had ever touched her. For most of the guests, this was just another celebration, another couple starting a new life. But for Victoria, simply standing there felt like stepping into a place that had once shut its doors on her without hesitation. When Ethan looked at her, there was no doubt in his eyes, no hesitation, only certainty, and that was something she had never been given before. As the ceremony ended and people gathered closer, the shift became more noticeable, not in what was said, but in what wasn't. Her father, Frank Dunn, kept his distance, speaking only when necessary, while her mother, Susan Dunn, maintained a polite smile that never reached her eyes. And then there was her sister, Olga Dunn. Standing slightly closer than the others, watching everything with a calm expression that felt too controlled to be natural. When she finally stepped forward, her voice was warm, her words perfectly chosen, congratulating Victoria as if nothing had ever happened between them, as if the past had simply disappeared without leaving anything behind. Victoria responded the same way, matching the tone, keeping everything smooth, controlled, and distant, because anything else would have broken the fragile balance that held the moment together. Not far from them, a man stood observing quietly, someone who seemed comfortable in the setting without trying to be part of it. That was Kevin Shaw, introduced briefly as a close friend of Ethan, the kind of person who knew how to blend into conversations while noticing more than he revealed. When he shook Victoria's hand, his smile was polite, measured, and gone just as quickly as it appeared. The reception moved forward, music grew louder, conversations overlapped, glasses were raised, and from a distance, it all looked exactly how it should, yet beneath that surface, something remained unsettled, something that never fully aligned. As the night stretched on, Ethan leaned closer, speaking quietly, suggesting it was time to leave, his tone light but certain, as if he had been waiting for that moment all evening. Victoria nodded without hesitation. They said their goodbyes quickly, without drawing attention, moving through the crowd with ease, until the noise faded behind them and the night became still again. The drive began quietly, the road nearly empty, the city lights fading as they moved farther away, leaving only the sound of the engine and the distant rhythm of tires against the pavement. Ethan kept one hand on the wheel, the other resting near hers, his focus steady, his posture relaxed, as if nothing could disrupt the calm that had settled between them. Victoria leaned back slightly, her gaze shifting forward, taking in the darkness ahead, the kind that made everything feel distant, disconnected from what had just happened. And then, without warning, a sharp blast of a horn cut through the silence, followed by a surge of light rushing straight toward them, too fast, too close, leaving no time to react. The impact came instantly, violent and overwhelming, the force twisting the car as metal collided, glass shattered. And everything that had felt controlled just seconds earlier broke apart without resistance. When she opened her eyes again, everything felt distant. The ceiling above her was bright but unfamiliar, the air carried a sterile stillness, and the faint sound of machines created a rhythm that didn't belong to anything she recognized. Victoria Dunn didn't move at first, not because she couldn't, but because something inside her hesitated, as if her body understood before her mind did that nothing was the same anymore. A nurse stepped closer the moment she stirred, speaking gently, asking her to stay still, but Victoria's focus shifted past her, searching for something that wasn't there. Her breathing changed, slower at first, then sharper, as the absence became impossible to ignore. She tried to speak, her voice weak, barely forming the words, asking where he was, asking in a way that sounded more like a demand than a question, but no one answered immediately. The silence stretched just long enough to turn uncertainty into fear. Her mother stood near the corner of the room, her posture rigid, her expression controlled in a way that felt unnatural, while her father avoided looking directly at her, his gaze fixed somewhere else, as if distance could make the moment easier. Victoria's eyes moved between them, reading what they wouldn't say, understanding what they were trying to hold back, and that realization hit harder than any physical pain. When the truth was finally spoken, it wasn't dramatic, it wasn't loud, it was quiet, almost careful, delivered in a tone that made it feel final before she could react. Everything inside her froze for a second, then broke all at once, not through screams or sudden movement, but through a kind of silence that swallowed everything else. Time passed in fragments after that, moments blending together without clear edges, visitors coming and going, voices repeating the same words about strength and healing, none of it reaching her in a way that mattered. What stayed instead were the small details, the things people didn't realize they were revealing. Her sister remained close, too present, offering comfort with a consistency that felt rehearsed rather than natural, watching Victoria carefully, not with concern, but with something more controlled, more measured. At times, their eyes met, and in those brief seconds, there was no warmth. Only a quiet awareness that something unspoken existed between them. Even the way she spoke felt calculated, every word placed carefully, never too much, never too little, as if she was following a script only she understood. The police arrived not long after, their tone professional, their questions direct but limited, explaining that they were still reviewing the situation, that certain details didn't fully align yet, though they didn't go into specifics. Victoria listened without interrupting, her attention sharper now, not because she had strength, but because something beneath the surface had shifted. What they said wasn't enough to form answers, but it was enough to break the version of events everyone else seemed ready to accept. After they left, the room felt different, heavier, as if the space itself held on to what had just been said. Victoria turned her head slightly, her gaze settling on her sister again, noticing the brief pause in her expression before it returned to something neutral, something safe. It was small, almost unnoticeable, but it stayed with her longer than anything else. A week later, the version everyone accepted began to fall apart. The request came quietly but carried weight, asking Victoria to come to the station in person, not for a routine update, but because something had changed. She didn't ask many questions, she didn't hesitate, she simply agreed, even though her body had not fully recovered and every movement still carried a dull resistance that reminded her she wasn't supposed to be there yet. When she arrived, the room felt colder than expected, not in temperature, but in atmosphere. the kind that made every sound sharper and every silence heavier. Her father stood near the wall, arms crossed, avoiding unnecessary eye contact, while her mother remained seated, her posture stiff, her hands locked together in a way that suggested she was holding something back. Her sister was there too, standing slightly apart, her expression composed, her attention focused in a way that felt deliberate rather than emotional. On the other side of the room, Harold Price spoke briefly with one of the officers before turning toward Victoria, his face controlled, but not unreadable. There was something beneath the surface, something that hadn't been there before. No one explained anything immediately, which made the waiting feel longer than it actually was, stretching each second into something heavier than it should have been. Then the door opened, and the man responsible for the crash was brought in. He didn't look like someone who had simply made a mistake. His condition suggested something else entirely, something that had already happened before he ever walked into that room. When his eyes lifted, they didn't settle anywhere for long, moving quickly, avoiding connection, as if he understood that whatever he said next would change everything. One of the officers stepped forward, his tone direct, telling him to repeat what he had already said, not as a request, but as an order. The man hesitated at first, his voice low, uneven, but when he finally spoke, the room shifted in a way that no one could ignore. He didn't describe it as an accident. He didn't try to explain it away. Instead, he said something simpler, something that carried more weight than any detailed explanation could have. He said he was given instructions. No one interrupted him after that. The officer pressed further, asking who gave those instructions, asking for a name, something concrete, something that could be followed, but the answer didn't come the way anyone expected. The man shook his head, explaining that he never met the person directly, that everything went through someone else, someone who handled the details, the timing, the route, all of it arranged in advance without ever revealing the source behind it. The words settled heavily in the room, not because they were loud, but because of what they implied. This wasn't random. It wasn't a moment of bad luck. It was something planned, something that required knowledge no outsider would have. Victoria didn't move, her focus locked on the man as he continued, describing how he was told exactly when the car would be on that road, how the timing had to be precise, how there was no room for error. That detail stayed longer than the rest, repeating in her mind in a way that felt sharper each time. Someone knew where they would be, someone knew when they would leave, someone knew enough to make sure everything aligned. The officer asked again about the contact, about the number, about anything that could lead somewhere, but the answers remained limited, incomplete, like pieces of something intentionally kept out of reach. Around her, the reactions began to shift. Her father's expression tightened. Her mother looked down as if avoiding something she couldn't face. And her sister remained still, too still, her composure unchanged in a way that no longer felt natural. Victoria didn't say anything, but something inside her had already changed, something that moved past grief and into something colder, something that refused to accept what everyone else had been willing to believe just days before. While the investigation outside slowed down, something else quietly began to move forward. Harold Price did not rely on official updates. He didn't wait for reports or timelines. Instead, he started asking his own questions, reaching out to people who could find things faster and dig deeper than anyone assigned to the case. Victoria didn't follow every step, but she could see the shift in his behavior, the way his focus narrowed, the way his conversations became shorter, more direct, as if he was building something piece by piece without explaining it out loud. Not long after, Kevin Shaw became more present, stepping into situations where information was being discussed, offering insights that seemed useful, practical, and always just enough to move things forward without drawing attention to himself. He explained details about financial structures, about how certain policies worked, about how money could move without being obvious at first glance, and Harold listened carefully, not interrupting, not questioning too much. allowing the information to settle before deciding what to do with it. At the same time, small inconsistencies began to appear, not in obvious ways, but in patterns that didn't fully align. There were transactions connected to accounts that shouldn't have been active, movements that didn't match normal behavior, amounts that were broken into smaller pieces instead of being transferred directly, all of it subtle enough to avoid immediate suspicion, but clear enough to raise concern once someone started looking closely. Victoria became aware of these details gradually, not because she searched for them, but because fragments reached her through conversations she wasn't meant to be part of, through pauses that lasted slightly too long, through glances exchanged when they thought she wasn't paying attention. The name that surfaced more than once was her sister's, not in accusations, not in direct statements, but in connections that felt incomplete, as if people were circling around something they weren't ready to say yet. When she heard it the first time, she didn't react. She didn't question it. She simply held on to it, letting it sit without forcing it into meaning. But the second time it appeared, and then the third, it stopped feeling like coincidence. Kevin remained consistent throughout, calm, composed, always ready with explanations that made sense on the surface, suggesting possibilities that pointed outward rather than inward, directing attention toward external contacts, unknown intermediaries, anyone who existed outside the immediate circle. Harold listened, but something in his response changed, not in what he said, but in what he chose not to say, in the way he began verifying details independently instead of accepting them at face value. One evening, Victoria noticed a document left partially visible on a table, not hidden, but not meant to be seen either, and in that brief moment, she caught enough to understand that the situation was no longer just about what had happened on the road. It involved agreements, signatures, policies that had been updated recently, conditions that would only matter under specific outcomes, all tied together in a way that suggested preparation rather than coincidence. When she looked up, Kevin was already watching her, his expression unchanged, his presence steady, as if nothing about that moment required explanation. He didn't move closer. He didn't step away. He simply remained where he was, allowing the silence to stretch without breaking it. Harold entered shortly after, and whatever passed between them wasn't spoken openly, but it was clear something had shifted again, something that no longer fit within the version of events everyone else had been holding on to. One evening, they were all called back into the same room. The atmosphere felt controlled but heavy, as if everyone understood something important was about to be said, even if no one knew exactly what. Victoria Dunn sat quietly, her posture steady, her attention fixed ahead without shifting, while the rest of the room arranged itself around an unspoken tension. Her father stood near the edge of the space, his presence rigid. Her mother remained seated, hands clasped tightly, and her sister stood slightly apart, her expression composed in a way that had started to feel too deliberate over time. Kevin Shaw was there as well, positioned closer to the center than before, his stance relaxed, his gaze moving carefully between faces without settling for too long. Harold Price entered last, closing the distance slowly, not rushing, not hesitating, carrying with him a kind of certainty that didn't need to be announced. When he finally spoke, his tone was calm, but there was no room for interruption, no space for uncertainty. He didn't begin with explanations, he didn't repeat what was already known. Instead, he moved directly to what mattered, stating that the person behind everything was already in the room. The words landed without warning, cutting through whatever assumptions had remained. No one reacted immediately, the silence stretched, forcing everyone to process what had just been said before deciding how to respond. Victoria didn't move, but her focus sharpened, narrowing onto the space between Harold and the rest of the room, waiting for the moment that would turn possibility into something real. Harold didn't rush that moment. He allowed it to build, his gaze moving slowly across each face before stopping. When it did, it settled on her sister. Olga Dunn didn't react right away, her expression holding steady for a second longer than expected, as if she was deciding how to respond rather than reacting instinctively. When she finally spoke, her tone was controlled, dismissive, rejecting the accusation without raising her voice, suggesting there had been a mistake, that the conclusion didn't make sense. Harold didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. He simply continued, outlining connections that no longer sounded like coincidence, pointing to movements, to decisions, to details that had been overlooked before but now aligned too clearly to ignore. The room shifted again, not through noise, but through the way people began to look at her differently, the way doubt replaced certainty in their expressions. For a brief moment, Olga remained still, holding on to her composure, but then something changed, something subtle but undeniable. The calm expression broke just enough to reveal something colder underneath, something that had been there all along but carefully hidden. When she finally admitted it, she didn't do it with hesitation. She didn't try to soften it. She simply confirmed what had already been said, her voice steady, her gaze fixed forward without avoiding anyone in the room. The reaction that followed wasn't uniform. Her mother moved first, her voice breaking. Her father stepped forward with anger he hadn't shown before, but Olga didn't respond to any of it. She didn't react. She didn't defend herself further, as if those responses no longer mattered. Victoria remained still. Not because she didn't feel anything, but because what she felt had moved past shock into something quieter, something harder to define. Then Harold spoke again, and this time, his attention shifted, not away from Olga, but beyond her. He mentioned that she hadn't acted alone. The shift in the room was immediate, sharper than before, as attention moved again, searching for something that hadn't been considered yet. Kevin didn't step back, didn't interrupt, but the stillness around him changed, the space tightening in a way that made his presence impossible to ignore. Harold continued, laying out the connection, explaining how information had moved, how details had been shared, how access had been used in ways that only someone close could manage. Kevin listened without reacting at first, his expression neutral, but when he finally spoke, it wasn't denial that came, it was acknowledgement, quiet and direct, confirming his involvement without elaborating further than necessary. The room held that moment in silence, not because there was nothing to say, but because everything that needed to be understood had already been revealed. After that night, everything moved forward without waiting for anyone to catch up. The legal process began quickly, structured, and precise, leaving little room for emotion to interfere with what had already been set into motion. Charges were filed based on coordination, intent, and financial gain, and the evidence that had been uncovered left little space for interpretation. Olga Dunn was taken into custody without resistance, her composure returning in a way that felt detached from the situation itself, while Kevin Shaw followed under separate charges tied to facilitation and misuse of access, his earlier calm replaced with a silence that no longer carried control. Court proceedings unfolded over time, each step formal, each statement recorded, each detail placed into context until the full picture became impossible to dispute. The outcome reflected the weight of those actions, resulting in long-term imprisonment for both, sentences that removed them completely from the lives they had tried to manipulate. Outside of the courtroom, the impact spread differently, less structured, less contained. Frank Dunn withdrew from conversations almost entirely, his presence reduced to brief responses and long silences, while Susan Dunn remained caught between denial and acceptance, unable to reconcile what had happened with the version of her family she had held onto for years. No attempt was made to repair anything, no effort to bring people back together, because the distance that had existed before had now taken on a different form, one that no longer allowed for return. Victoria Dunn did not stay to watch any of it unfold beyond what was necessary. She handled what required her attention, signed what needed to be completed, and stepped away from everything else without hesitation. There were no final conversations, no attempts to explain or understand, no effort to revisit what had already been broken long before any of this happened. The separation was not sudden, it was clear, deliberate, and permanent. She left the place where everything had started and returned to a life that no longer included any part of what she had once called family. The absence that followed was not empty, it was defined, shaped by decisions that had been made without her and consequences that no longer involved her. Over time, what remained was not the memory of what had been lost, but the understanding of what had been revealed. Victoria no longer questioned why things had happened the way they did. She no longer searched for meaning in actions that had been driven by choices she could never control. Instead, she focused on what had become clear through everything that unfolded. That not every connection deserves to be preserved simply because it exists, and not every relationship holds value just because it shares a history. Some bonds are built on imbalance, on silence, on things left unresolved until they take a form that cannot be ignored. And when that happens, walking away is not loss, it is recognition. In the end, what defined her was not what had been taken, but what she chose to leave behind, and the understanding that moving forward sometimes means closing a door without looking back.